Hello everyone! Welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to talk about what happened to the Ottoman Empire after World War I. So let's get right into it. So at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. But why is that? Well, there's a few reasons. The first one being the British occupation of Istanbul. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, the Ottoman government decided to side with the Central Powers, which included Germany and Austria-Hungary, and in return for this alliance, the Germans gave them some military aid. However, it wasn't enough. Now, before the war, the Ottomans had already been in decline for quite some time, and so they were not able to hold off the Russians on the Caucasus front and the British and the French in the Middle East. As a result, the Ottoman army suffered a number of defeats. And then in 1916, the British launched an attack against the Dardanelles and successfully captured the Gallipoli Peninsula. And so, then the British occupied key parts of Turkey, including the capital city of Istanbul. The second reason was the Arab Revolt. You see, while the Ottoman Empire was busy fighting against the Russians, the British started encouraging the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans because they promised them independence if they did so. Now, the Arabs didn't like living under the rule of the Ottomans. This was mainly due to the fact that they were second-class citizens, and the Ottomans had also been losing many of their territories in the Middle East. And so the Arabs joined the British, and together they took over the Hejaz region, which included Mecca and Medina, which were very important to the Muslims all around the world. In fact, this is where the Prophet Muhammad was born. Third, there was the rise of Turkish nationalism. Even though the Ottomans ruled over many different people, such as the Arabs, the Kurds, the Albanians, and others, most of them didn't feel any loyalty towards the empire or its government, and the Turkish nationalists felt the same way. However, unlike the other groups, the Turks were able to unite and form a national army, and by 1919, the Turkish nationalists had taken control of Anatolia, which was the Asian part of the Ottoman Empire, and soon after, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk became the leader of the Turkish nationalists. Fourth, there was the Greco-Turkish conflict. After World War I, Greece wanted to expand its territory, and they set their eyes on the Ottoman Empire. And so they invaded the Ottoman-held city of Smyrna. But then the Turkish nationalists fought back and pushed them further inland. And lastly, there was the Armenian genocide. During the war, the Ottomans began persecuting the Armenians living in the empire, and it's estimated that between 1915 and 1923, over 1.5 million Armenians were killed. And so many of the surviving Armenians fled to Russia, France, and the United States, and this greatly weakened the Ottoman Empire. So in the end, at the Paris Peace Conference, the victors discussed the fate of the Ottoman lands. And in 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres was signed. And according to this treaty, the Ottoman Empire lost all of its territories outside of Anatolia and only kept control over the Asian part of the empire. In addition to this, Britain was given control over the Hejaz region, which was extremely important to the Muslims around the world. And so the Muslims were very angry about this. However, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his Turkish nationalist army fought against the British and other foreign powers to win back control over these territories. And by 1922, the Turkish nationalists had won. And so then the Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923, which officially ended the Ottoman-British War. And in this treaty, all the foreign powers recognized the new Turkish Republic, which replaced the Ottoman Empire. But why did the Ottoman Empire fall apart at this point in time? Well, there were two reasons for this. The first one being the Ottoman military. As we mentioned earlier in the video, the Ottoman army had been significantly weakened during the war. And on top of this, the Turkish nationalists had formed their own military force and were fighting against the Ottomans. And so, at this point in time, the Ottoman Sultan no longer had control over the army. The second reason was the declining population. As we mentioned earlier, the Ottoman Empire had experienced a number of famines in the early 19th century, which led to a sharp decline in population. On top of this, during World War I, many soldiers lost their lives, and even more civilians died because of the diseases, the famine, and the deportations. And so, when the war ended, the population of the empire was much smaller than it once had been. Okay, now let's take a look at what happened to the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI. When the war began, Mehmed VI was only 16 years old, and so his mother, the Sultan's wife, secretly took the throne in his place. However, she didn't do a good job because the Ottoman Empire lost many territories during her reign. And so then the Turkish nationalists forced the Sultan and his family to abdicate the throne, and they left the country in exile. And so that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, now let's move on to what happened to the Ottoman sultans after they left Turkey. So Mehmed VI and his family went into exile in Italy, where they spent the rest of their lives. Then the second reason is that there were some Ottoman princes who had no interest in taking the throne, and they simply lived ordinary lives. For example, Orhan Effendi was a high-ranking Ottoman prince who could have become the Sultan, but he chose to live the life of a civilian instead. He worked as a police officer and then later opened a tobacco shop, and he lived until 1926, which was 3 years after the Ottoman Empire fell. The third option was that some Ottoman princes tried to come back to power. For example, Abdülmecid II, who was the brother of Mehmed VI, tried to make a comeback, but he failed, and so he had to go into exile in Spain, where he died in 1926. Lastly, there were some Ottoman princes who tried to lead rebellions against the new Turkish government. For example, there was a man named Ali. I wanted to become the Sultan, and he led rebellions both in Istanbul and in the city of Kahramanmaraş. However, he was unsuccessful, and he was executed in 1926. Alright, now let's wrap up this video. So to sum everything up, the Ottoman Empire was one of the longest-lasting empires in history. It lasted for over 600 years, and it was one of the richest empires of its time. However, during the 18th and 19th centuries, the empire began to decline due to a number of factors, including corruption, economic problems, and foreign domination, and this led to the empire losing many of its territories. Then came World War I, which greatly weakened the empire, and it led to the Ottoman Sultan losing control over his army and a lot of his land. After the war, the victorious powers met up to discuss the fate of the Ottoman lands, and they decided to give most of it away. And on top of this, the Ottoman population had been sharply reduced during the war, and so the Sultan no longer had enough soldiers or subjects. And so that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and maybe consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.